Look closely at a map of the world, and you'll notice a place where the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean seem almost close enough to touch each other. Between them lies only a narrow strip of land, an approximately 80-kilometer wide barrier that held back global trade for centuries. Today, this place is known as Panama. If a ship needed to travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, it had to sail all the way around South America. A journey of roughly 11,000 to 15,000 kilometers. And the route was no easy passage. The dangerous storms around Cape Horn could swallow entire ships. Sailors often spent months lost at sea. Crews fell ill, ships sank, and valuable cargo disappeared into the ocean. The other option was to stop the ship, unload the cargo, transport it across the land to the other side, and then load it onto another ship. It was slow, extremely expensive, and filled with danger at every step. But the world was changing. Trade was expanding. Empires were growing. And humanity was no longer willing to accept this natural barrier created by nature. Then people made a decision to cut through this land. Not with a tunnel, but by building a massive ship canal through which entire vessels could pass. And that decision gave birth to the Panama Canal. But the Panama Canal was not a romantic dream. It was born out of necessity. Shorter routes meant saving time, saving money, and gaining control over global trade. It meant that goods, oil, weapons, and naval fleets could move from one ocean to another, not in weeks, but in a matter of hours and days. That is why many of the world's great powers wanted to build this canal. From Spain to France and Britain, every empire understood that whoever controlled this route would control the pace of global trade. Later, the United States joined the race as well. Some historians even believe that without the Panama Canal, America might never have become the global superpower it is today. Today, nearly 1,000 ships, more than 40 million tons of cargo, and trade from over 150 countries pass through this route every month. More than 2,000 ports around the world are connected to this canal in one way or another. But this route was not built with water alone. It was built on the hard work of thousands of laborers, on disease, accidents, and the foundations of nearly 25,000 deaths. Because the Panama Canal was not just an engineering project, it was a battle between humanity and nature. Mountains were cut apart, forests were blasted away, rivers were redirected, and even the division of a nation became part of the story. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that today, in 2026, as climate change and drought threaten the water levels of the Panama Canal, a question is being raised once again. Did humanity take a route from nature that was never meant to be taken? And is nature now trying to reclaim it? And how was this canal built upon the graves of thousands of workers? Today, we will uncover the astonishing history of the Panama Canal. In reality, the dream of the Panama Canal was not a new one. For centuries, the world's great powers had wanted to cut through this narrow strip of land and connect the two oceans. Every empire understood that if a direct route could be created between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, global trade and naval power would be transformed forever. The first major survey of the region was ordered in 1534 by Charles V. At the time, Spain and Portugal were at the height of their maritime power, and Charles V wanted his navy to move quickly between the world's two great oceans. But the technology of the 16th century was nowhere near capable of handling such a massive project. In that era, the idea seemed more like a fantasy than a realistic plan. Even so, the dream never disappeared. Over the following centuries, several nations attempted to create this route. In the late 17th century, Scotland made an effort but failed. Later, the United Kingdom also explored the possibility, but Panama's jungle, relentless rain, and challenging geography repeatedly proved stronger than human ambition. The real turning point came in the late 19th century, when France took control of the project. At that time, France was considered one of the world's greatest engineering powers. The main reason was the success of the Suez Canal. The French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had astonished the world by building the Suez Canal, now wanted to repeat the same achievement in Panama. But there was one problem. Panama was not Suez. Around Suez lay a flat desert, where the ground was stable and the climate was relatively calm. Panama, on the other hand, was a living jungle. Dense forests covered the landscape, heavy rain fell constantly, rivers could flood within hours, and mountain slopes were always shifting. In the very place where France wanted to build a canal, nature itself seemed to redraw the map every single day. Despite this, Ferdinand de Lesseps made the mistake that would eventually doom the entire project. He tried to build a sea-level canal in Panama, just as he had done in Suez. In other words, he planned a canal where ships could travel directly at sea level from one ocean to the other without being raised or lowered. But Panama's geography made that vision nearly impossible. The land between the two oceans was not flat. Instead, it consisted of a long backbone of hills and rock formations that would have to be cut through. On top of that, tropical rainfall constantly weakened the soil. Workers would spend the entire day digging, only to watch the slopes collapse again during the night. More dangerous than all of these challenges was an enemy that people at the time did not even fully understand: disease. Yellow fever and malaria spread through the construction site like a force of death. In that era, people did not yet know that mosquitoes were responsible for transmitting these diseases. Workers labored among stagnant water, intense heat, and unsanitary conditions. Many would leave for work in the morning, only for their bodies to be carried out by evening. Slowly, the Panama project began to look less like an engineering mission and more like a field of death. Thousands of workers had already died, and costs continued to rise. Heavy machinery sank into the mud, rainfall repeatedly halted construction, and landslides buried entire excavation zones under tons of earth. For nearly 14 years, France struggled with the project, but in the end, its dream collapsed. Approximately 22,000 workers had lost their lives. Around $287 million had been spent, and Ferdinand de Lesseps' company went bankrupt. People began to see the Panama Canal as a cursed place. Many believed that nature had created this land to remain a barrier between the two oceans, and that humanity would never be able to change it. But where France had given up, the United States was preparing to step onto the stage. In reality, America wanted more than just a canal. It needed a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, one that could push its navy, trade, and future power far ahead of the rest of the world. But one major obstacle still remained. At that time, Panama was part of Colombia, and Colombia was unwilling to grant America the land and rights needed for the project. But this time, America had not come empty-handed. By then, US President Theodore Roosevelt had realized that the Panama Canal was not merely an engineering project, it was the key to America's future. And so, when negotiations failed to produce a solution, the United States turned to geopolitics. In 1903, a rebellion against Colombia began in the Panama region. The American government openly supported the rebels. US warships were positioned off the coast of Panama to prevent Colombian forces from reaching the area and crushing the uprising. Within just a few days, Panama declared itself an independent nation, and soon after, history took a turn that would change global trade forever. The newly formed nation of Panama granted the United States nearly 500 square miles of land for the construction of the Panama Canal. It also gave America extensive rights over the canal zone. In other words, the route that France had failed to build was now under direct American control. In 1904, the United States officially began work on the Panama Canal. This time, the project was not left to ambition alone. America had learned a great deal from the French failure. The construction effort would now move forward with military discipline, scientific planning, and modern engineering. Responsibility for this enormous project was given to George Washington Goethals. But obtaining land, permission, and funding was not enough. America still had to defeat the two enemies that had destroyed the French effort. The first was Panama's geography and the forces of nature. The second was disease. American engineers understood that if they attempted to build a sea-level canal as the French had done, the project would never be completed. Panama was not flat land. It was a region of mountains, rock formations, relentless rainfall, and rivers that could transform within a matter of hours. That is why the United States made the most revolutionary decision of the entire project. The canal would not be built at sea level. Instead, ships would be raised and lowered through a system of locks. The idea was far ahead of its time. From a technical perspective, the Panama Canal functions like a giant water elevator. Ships first enter massive lock chambers. Then, with the help of gravity, millions of liters of water are allowed to flow into the chambers, gradually lifting the vessels upward. The ships then pass through the artificial lake created in the center of Panama before being lowered again through another series of locks on the opposite side. This system completely changed the engineering strategy. Engineers no longer needed to cut every mountain down to sea level. Instead, they could take advantage of the land's natural elevation. Excavation was reduced, the project became more stable, and most importantly, for the first time, the Panama Canal began to look truly achievable. Friends, this battle against nature was not limited to mountains and rain. The real danger was still hiding deep within the jungle: malaria and yellow fever. During the French project, thousands of workers had died from these diseases. At the time, people did not fully understand how they spread. But by now, science had advanced. Doctors and researchers had discovered that mosquitoes were responsible for transmitting these deadly illnesses. And that is where the most important, yet least discussed battle of this entire story began: health engineering. American authorities launched a massive campaign against mosquitoes in Panama. Swamps and stagnant water were drained. Unsanitary areas were cleaned up. Drainage systems were built throughout the region. Insecticides were sprayed regularly. Mosquito screens were installed in buildings and camps to keep mosquitoes out. Continuous medical inspections became routine. These measures may seem ordinary today, but in the early 20th century, they were nothing short of revolutionary. Gradually, the results began to appear. Cases of yellow fever started to decline. For the first time, workers began to feel that this place was not just a field of death, and with renewed confidence, they threw themselves into the work. Having the idea for the Panama Canal and turning it into reality were two completely different things, because now America had to confront Panama's most dangerous obstacle: its mountains. The most difficult section of the Panama Canal was the area now known as the Culebra Cut, or the Gailar Cut. This was the place where engineers had to carve through an entire chain of mountains and rock formations to create a passage wide enough for ships to pass. Today, when ships travel through this section, it appears perfectly ordinary. But there was a time when it was considered one of the most dangerous construction sites in the world. Amid the tropical jungle, heavy rain fell constantly. Everywhere there was mud, slippery ground, and unstable soil. In these conditions, thousands of workers labored day and night. Dynamite blasts echoed every day. Massive steam shovels and excavation machines cut through rock, while bulldozers removed enormous amounts of earth. But the true lifelines of this construction project were the railroads. Thousands of railway wagons operated continuously, carrying away millions of cubic meters of soil and rock without stopping. Yet Panama's terrain challenged the engineers every single day. As soon as workers cut through one section, tropical rainfall would weaken the soil, causing entire slopes to collapse again. In many cases, days of excavation work would disappear beneath landslides in a matter of minutes. Some landslides were so massive that entire railway lines vanished beneath the earth. Workers were forced to dig out the same areas over and over again. This was not just construction, it was an exhausting war against the mountains themselves. During this struggle, America realized that excavation alone would never complete the project. Instead of trying to defeat Panama's natural environment, they would have to work with it. And that realization led to the creation of the most brilliant part of the entire canal system, the Gatun Lake. By building the Gatun Dam, the United States created a massive artificial lake. At the time, it was one of the largest man-made lakes in the world. But it was not built merely to store water. this lake became the true heart of the Panama Canal. In reality, the central section of the Panama Canal is not a narrow man-made channel. Most of a ship's journey through the canal takes place across this vast lake. In other words, the engineers turned the problem itself into the solution. The same rain and rivers that had once destroyed construction efforts were now being used to operate the canal. Gatun Lake not only provided a route for ships, but also supplied the water required to run the lock system. Because the Panama Canal does not operate with pumps, instead water is moved using gravity. And that is what makes it such an engineering marvel. But how? Whenever a ship enters the canal, it first moves into a massive lock chamber. Large gates are then closed behind it. Through underground tunnels and valves, millions of liters of water are released into the chamber. As the water level gradually rises, the entire ship rises with it. It works much like a giant water elevator. The ship is lifted step by step from one chamber to the next until it reaches the level of Gatun Lake. On the opposite side, the same process is reversed to lower the ship back down. In total, vessels are raised about 26 meters above sea level. That may not sound like much, but when ships hundreds of meters long and weighing thousands of tons move through this system, its true complexity becomes clear. Precision was the most important factor. The lock chambers were built with such limited clearance that ships could not afford even the slightest mistake. For many years, specially designed electric locomotives known as mules were used. These locomotives kept ships centered within the canal using cables, preventing them from striking the chamber walls. That is when it becomes clear why the impact of this achievement was so enormous. This is not just a canal. It is a highly complex industrial system where water, gravity, engineering, and logistics work together as one. The United States had set a target of 1916 to complete the Panama Canal, but construction progressed so rapidly that the project was finished nearly 2 years ahead of schedule, and then came the day that would permanently change the map of global trade. In 1914, when the Panama Canal officially opened to ships, its impact was not limited to Panama or the United States. Shipping routes around the world were transformed. The sea route between America's east coast and west coast suddenly became thousands of kilometers shorter. Ships traveling from Asia toward the Atlantic no longer had to make the dangerous journey around the entire continent of South America. Voyages that once took months could now be completed in just days. Gradually, ports, shipping companies, and global supply chains around the world adapted to this new shortcut. The Panama Canal was no longer just a canal. It had become the heartbeat of the global trade system. But the canal always had one major limitation: the size of the ships. The original lock chambers of the Panama Canal were built to accommodate vessels of a specific size. As a result, the term Panamax ships was used for decades. It referred to ships designed specifically to fit through the Panama Canal's locks. Shipping companies even determined the width and height of their vessels according to the canal's dimensions. But as time passed, global trade expanded rapidly. Container ships grew larger than ever before. The world needed vessels capable of carrying millions of containers and massive amounts of cargo in a single voyage. And that was when the Panama Canal itself had to evolve. In 2016, the canal's expansion project was completed. New locks, much larger than the original ones, were built to allow massive modern ships to pass through the route. These vessels became known as Neo-Panamax ships. Ships that were too large for the original Panama Canal locks, but could navigate through the newly expanded system. This was more than just an expansion. It was proof that the Panama Canal would have to keep evolving in order to remain relevant. But despite this massive modernization, the Panama Canal still rests on a surprisingly fragile foundation. Because the true fuel of this entire canal system is not oil or electricity, it is fresh water. Every time a ship passes through the lock system, millions of liters of fresh water are used. That water eventually flows out into the ocean. As a result, the entire operation of the canal depends on rainfall and the water level of its lakes. If rainfall decreases, or if the level of Gatun Lake falls too low, the number of ships allowed to pass through the canal may have to be reduced. and that is exactly why climate change is becoming the greatest threat facing the Panama Canal today. Changing weather patterns, droughts, and irregular rainfall are now directly affecting global trade. In some cases, ship traffic has had to be restricted simply to conserve water. In other words, the canal that once symbolized humanity's victory over nature now appears once again to be standing at nature's mercy. The story of the Panama Canal is not limited to engineering and construction. There is another side to it that is often overlooked: geopolitics. Because the Panama Canal is not just a route for ships, it is one of the world's most important strategic choke points. Whoever controls this passage does not simply control the flow of water, but also the movement of time, trade, transportation costs, and global supply chains. That is why, for most of the 20th century, the United States maintained significant influence over the Panama Canal. The canal zone was practically under American control, and it was this route that helped strengthen both the US Navy and the American economy. But over time, opposition grew within Panama. Many people felt that the most important route on their own land was being controlled by another country. Gradually, international pressure and political negotiations began to build. Then, after decades of treaties and a long transfer process, control of the Panama Canal was finally handed over completely to Panama in 1999. Since then, the canal has been operated by the Panama Canal Authority. Today, it is not only a symbol of Panama, but also the backbone of its economy. Revenue generated by the canal makes up a significant portion of the country's income, and this small nation now manages one of the most important trade routes in the world. So do you think the United States could have become a superpower without the Panama Canal? And if the canal were to shut down for some reason, which country do you think would suffer the greatest impact? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and share it. And for more powerful documentaries like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the notification bell. Thank you for watching.